This is phobia. Not everything makes sense. Some stories don't end. And the most disturbing truth does not make a sound. Listen closely.
I can see what looks like flashing lights in the distance. 19 years old, Brandon Swanson tells his father, breathing hard. The spring air carries the sound of rushing water somewhere nearby. His car sits abandoned in a roadside ditch miles behind him. And Brandon believes he's walking toward the small town of Lynd, toward safety and home. But Brandon is not where he thinks he is. For 47 minutes, he has been trying to find his parents, and they have been trying to find him in the vast agricultural flatland that stretches endlessly in all directions. Suddenly, Brandon's voice changes. He says, "Oh shit!" The line goes dead, and he has not been seen for the past 17 years. This is the disappearance of Brandon Swanson. Before we begin, please note that the disappearance of Brandon Swanson remains an active investigation. The information presented in this episode is based on publicly available sources. This case involves a real family who continues to search for answers. We ask that you engage with this content respectfully and remember that behind every mystery are real people affected by these events. Brandon Victor Swanson was 19 years old and seemed to have everything figured out. Born on January 30th, 1989, in Marshall, Minnesota, he grew up in a close-knit family with his parents, Brian and Annette, and younger sister, Jamin. Marshall was a place where agriculture dominated both the landscape and the local economy, a town of roughly 14,000 people surrounded by endless corn and soybean fields. Brandon loved reading, often found with his nose buried in a book. Science fascinated him particularly, and after graduating from Marshall High School in 2007, he'd chosen to stay close to home for a practical reason. He enrolled in a one-year renewable energy program at Minnesota West Community and Technical College in Canby, studying wind turbine technology. The program made sense for someone living in southwestern Minnesota, where wind farms dotted the horizon and represented the future of the region's energy production. But Brandon had bigger plans brewing. He'd been accepted to Iowa Western College for the fall semester of 2008, which would take him more than 250 miles from home for the first time in his life. The prospect excited him. New opportunities, independence, the chance to build on his technical education in renewable energy. At 5 feet 6 inches and 120 pounds, with naturally curly brown hair and blue eyes behind wire-framed glasses, Brandon dealt with a challenge most people never knew about. A childhood injury had left him legally blind in his left eye, which sometimes affected his depth perception, particularly in low-light conditions. May 13th, 2008 was the final day of classes at Minnesota West. After a full academic year of studying wind energy systems and preparing for his transfer to Iowa, Brandon was ready to celebrate. The spring semester was officially over, and summer stretched ahead before his next academic adventure would begin. But things don't always go as planned. That day was the beginning of something else. The end of semester celebration began in familiar territory. That evening, Brandon attended a gathering at a friend's house in Lynd, Minnesota, just 7 miles southwest of his family home in Marshall. The party was low-key by college standards. Friends from his wind turbine program, marking the end of another academic year with the kind of casual socializing that characterized small-town Minnesota gatherings. Brandon drank moderately, according to witnesses who later spoke with investigators. Nobody described him as intoxicated or even particularly affected by alcohol. This was typical Brandon, responsible, measured. Someone who understood his limits and respected them. The gathering was relaxed, more about camaraderie than excess. Between 10:30 and 11 p.m, Brandon left the Lynd party and drove to Canby, roughly 35 miles away, where another friend was hosting a separate gathering. This second party was described as a send-off for a classmate who would be leaving the area. Brandon wanted to say goodbye properly, a thoughtful gesture that reflected his character. The drive to Canby took him through the heart of southwestern Minnesota's agricultural country. Highway 68 provided the most direct route between the two towns, cutting straight through farmland that stretched to the horizon in every direction. The landscape was quintessentially Midwestern, flat expanses broken only by scattered farmsteads, grain elevators, and the occasional grove of trees planted as windbreaks. At the Canby party, Brandon again drank moderately. Witnesses later reported that he had at least one shot of whiskey, but nobody considered him impaired. He socialized briefly, said his goodbyes, and by all accounts seemed perfectly normal. Shortly after midnight on May 14th, he decided it was time to head home to Marshall. Here, Brandon made a choice that may have complicated the events that followed. Instead of taking Highway 68, the direct, well-lit route he would normally use, he opted for a network of rural gravel roads that wound through the farming country between Canby and Marshall. Friends and family would later speculate about this decision. Perhaps he wanted to avoid any potential police checkpoints on the main highway. Perhaps he simply felt confident navigating the back roads he'd grown familiar with during his year of commuting to classes. The gravel roads Brandon chose were typical of rural Minnesota. Straight lines following section boundaries, creating a grid pattern across the agricultural landscape. These roads served the practical needs of farmers moving equipment and grain trucks between fields and elevators. They weren't designed for nighttime navigation by someone with compromised depth perception. Brandon's route would have taken him through a patchwork of privately owned farmland, past empty fields preparing for spring planting, and over small bridges crossing drainage ditches and seasonal waterways. The Yellow Medicine River meandered somewhere in this maze of agricultural infrastructure, swollen with spring runoff and flowing higher and faster than usual for the season. Driving alone through this landscape in the early morning hours, Brandon encountered the first sign of trouble around 1:15 a.m. His Chevrolet Lumina, a reliable car that had served him well during his daily commutes, somehow veered off the gravel road and slid into a ditch. The crash itself was minor, more embarrassing than dangerous. Brandon's Lumina had slid into a roadside ditch, and the car had become what locals call high-centered. The wheels were elevated just enough that they couldn't gain traction on the ground below. The vehicle showed no obvious damage, and Brandon himself was uninjured. Under normal circumstances, this would have been the kind of mishap that gets resolved with a phone call and a tow strap. But these were not normal circumstances. At 1:54 a.m, Brandon called his parents from his cell phone. Brian and Annette Swanson were accustomed to late-night calls from their son. College students keep irregular hours, and Brandon was reliable about checking in when plans changed. But something in his voice immediately suggested this wasn't a routine call. "I'm in a ditch," he told them, explaining that he'd run off a gravel road and couldn't get the car moving again. More concerning was his assessment of his location. Brandon told his parents he believed he was somewhere near Lynd, the small town where he'd attended the first party earlier that evening. If true, this meant he was only about 10 minutes from the family home in Marshall. Brian and Annette didn't hesitate. They got into their pickup truck and drove toward where they thought Brandon was waiting. The plan seemed straightforward: locate their son's stranded vehicle, help him get unstuck, or arrange for a tow, and have everyone safely home within the hour. But as they drove through Lynd and the surrounding area, they encountered an immediate problem. There was no sign of Brandon's car anywhere. They searched the likely routes between Lynd and Marshall, checking ditches and examining any area where a vehicle might have run off the road. They could not see Brandon or his car. Throughout this search, Brandon remained on the phone with his father. They created a simple system to help locate each other. Both would flash their headlights simultaneously. Brandon could activate his high beams, while Brian would flash the headlights on the pickup truck. In the flat agricultural landscape of southwestern Minnesota, such signals should have been visible for considerable distances. But neither father nor son could see the other's lights. This strange situation continued for several minutes. Brandon described what he could see from his location: darkness broken by scattered farmstead lights in the distance, the glow that he interpreted as coming from Lynd. Brian described his view from various points around the town, but nothing matched what Brandon was reporting. Growing frustrated with the failed attempts to locate each other, Brandon told his father that he was going to leave the car and walk toward the lights he could see. Brandon estimated the distance at about a mile. An easy walk that should bring him to town within 15 minutes or so. Brian wasn't comfortable with this plan, but Brandon seemed confident about the direction and distance. They agreed that Brandon would walk toward what he believed was Lynd, while Brian would drive to the parking lot of a local bar where they could meet. Brandon's cell phone battery was holding up well, and staying connected seemed like the safest approach. As long as they could talk to each other, Brandon could provide updates on his progress and call for help if he encountered any problems during the walk. The first part of the walk seemed to confirm Brandon's assessment. He moved steadily across the farmland, climbing over wire fences and navigating around farm equipment and other obstacles. He described the terrain to his father as he went, and the ongoing conversation suggested everything was proceeding normally. But as minutes stretched into an hour, both Brandon and his parents began to realize that something was fundamentally wrong with their understanding of the situation. Brian Swanson drove methodically through every possible location where his son might be walking. He checked the roads around Lynd, expanded his search to neighboring townships, and even drove routes that seemed unlikely. Meanwhile, Annette had joined the search in their second vehicle, covering different areas and hoping to spot Brandon's distinctive figure moving across the darkened fields. The flat terrain of southwestern Minnesota should have made this relatively simple. There were no hills or forests to obstruct sight lines, no complex topography to create confusion. On a clear night, with good visibility, the lights of vehicles and towns could be seen for miles across the agricultural landscape. Yet despite this apparent advantage, the three family members remained completely unable to locate each other. Brandon continued to insist that he could see lights ahead of him that he believed marked the town of Lynd. These lights seemed to be drawing closer as he walked, confirming his belief that he was moving in the correct direction. But his parents, searching every possible approach to Lynd, saw no sign of anyone walking toward town. There was another important detail. Throughout the call, Brandon made references to hearing water nearby. The sound seemed consistent, suggesting he was walking parallel to a stream or drainage ditch rather than crossing temporary wet areas. This detail would become significant when investigators tried to reconstruct his probable route. As the call continued, Brandon's breathing had become noticeably heavier. He'd been walking cross-country for nearly an hour, climbing fences and navigating uneven terrain in the darkness. His depth perception issues, caused by his visual impairment, would have made this nighttime trek particularly challenging. Yet his voice remained steady and coherent. There was no indication of panic, disorientation, or impairment that might suggest a medical emergency or alcohol-related confusion. Brian continued to coordinate the search from his end, suggesting alternative meeting points and trying to reconcile Brandon's descriptions with the actual geography around Lynd. The conversation had settled into a rhythm. Brandon providing updates on his progress and observations, Brian confirming his own location and search efforts, both working toward the same goal of reuniting safely. But something strange happened. Without warning, Brandon's voice changed, and he said, "Oh shit." The words exploded through the phone connection with a force that conveyed alarm. This wasn't frustration or mild surprise. It was the sound of someone encountering something unexpected and potentially dangerous. Brian later described the tone as shocked, frightened, the voice of someone who had suddenly realized he was in serious trouble. Then the line went silent. "The call has ended." Brian shouted his son's name into the phone, but received no response. He tried calling back immediately, and the call went through, indicating that Brandon's phone was still functional, but nobody answered. Brian continued, trying to reach his son, while simultaneously driving to every location where Brandon might have been walking. Annette joined the frantic calling efforts, and both parents spent the remaining hours of darkness driving through the rural areas around Lynd, calling Brandon's name and searching for any sign of him. They checked ditches, farmyards, and any structure where someone might have sought shelter or help. They found nothing. By dawn, it was clear that something terrible had happened to Brandon Swanson. But what exactly remained unknown? The 19-year-old had simply vanished from a landscape that offered few places to hide and fewer ways to disappear without a trace. At 6:30 a.m. on May 14th, Brian and Annette Swanson contacted the Lynd police to report their son missing. The officers were reluctant to begin an immediate search. They pointed out that Brandon was legally an adult and suggested that it wasn't unusual for a 19-year-old to stay out all night, particularly after the final day of college. One officer told Annette Swanson that Brandon had a right to be missing. The dismissive response stunned parents who knew with absolute certainty that their responsible, reliable son would never simply disappear without explanation. However, as the morning progressed and more details emerged about the circumstances of Brandon's disappearance, law enforcement recognized the seriousness of the situation. The fact that he had been speaking with his parents until the moment he vanished, combined with the mysterious final words and the rural location, convinced authorities to launch a formal investigation. The breakthrough came when investigators used cell phone tower technology to track Brandon's approximate location during his final call. The data revealed that Brandon had not been near Lynd at all. Instead, his phone had been communicating with a tower that placed him in the area around Porter, Minnesota, roughly 25 miles from where he believed he was. Using this information, search teams located Brandon's Chevrolet Lumina around 12:30 p.m. on May 14th. The car was found approximately 1.5 miles north of Taunton, near the borders of Yellow Medicine, Lincoln, and Lyon counties. Just as Brandon had described, the vehicle was stuck in a roadside ditch with no apparent damage. The keys were missing, and there were no obvious signs of foul play. One of the most extensive search efforts in Minnesota history began. Over the course of several weeks, more than 500 volunteers joined professional search teams. 34 trained search dogs were brought in from 9 different states. Aircraft provided aerial surveillance while ground teams methodically combed the rural landscape. Despite this massive effort, searchers found no trace of Brandon Swanson. Search dogs traced his scent across 3 miles of farmland to the Yellow Medicine River, where the trail simply ended. One dog continued across the water and picked up the scent again on the opposite bank, following it along another gravel road before losing it again, near the Yellow Medicine County line. The search area encompasses 140 square miles of agricultural land, much of it still inaccessible to investigators because some property owners continue to refuse permission for search teams. As recently as 2021, when drought conditions dried up portions of the Yellow Medicine River, excavation crews returned to sift through previously underwater areas. They found nothing. Tips still arrive regularly at law enforcement agencies, but none have produced meaningful leads. Brandon's case remains active, and the Yellow Medicine County Sheriff's Office continues periodic searches when farming seasons permit. Brian and Annette Swanson still live in Marshall, and every night they turn on their porch light, the same light they switched on the night Brandon disappeared. "There's no reason to turn it off now," Brian has said. The light burns as a beacon, a symbol of hope that somehow, someday, their son might find his way home. 17 years have passed since Brandon Swanson's voice disappeared into the Minnesota darkness, and the mystery remains as complete as it was that first morning. In the vast agricultural landscape of southwestern Minnesota, Brandon Swanson stepped into an impossibility and never stepped back out. No one knows what happened to him. No one knows what have he seen last. Brandon Swanson's whereabouts remain unknown, and the porch light is still on. I'm Eleanor Graves, and this was Phobia.
The story ends here. Don't expect answers. We return next week.